There's a building standing 321 meters over the Arabian Gulf right now, and the ground underneath it does not exist. Not in the way ground is supposed to exist. In 1994, you could have flown a helicopter over this exact spot and seen nothing but water. No reef, no sandbar, no rock breaking the surface, just the flat gray skin of the sea stretching to the horizon. Today there is a hotel there that people cross. Oceans to photograph, a hotel so recognizable it has become shorthand for an entire country, and almost nobody who looks at it understands the secret sitting underneath the marble and the gold leaf. Humans built the land first. Before a single wall went up, before a single window was set, men had to invent solid earth out of open sea, and then convince a 130,000-ton tower to trust it. That is not a metaphor. That is what actually happened, and by the end of this video, you will never look at this building the same way again. Because somewhere in the next few minutes, you're going to find out exactly how close this entire project came to failing. Before it ever left the drawing board, why the engineers behind it were essentially betting $1 billion on friction instead of rock, and what it actually took to keep a 100,000-ton tower standing upright in open water for over 2 decades without the ground beneath it ever giving way. Stay with this one to the end, because the final detail, the one number almost nobody talks about, is the thing that will make you rethink every luxury hotel photo you've ever scrolled past. Picture the order coming down in 1993. Sheikh Mohammed did not ask for a hotel. He asked for an image, one silhouette so singular that the moment a person saw it anywhere in the world on any screen, they would think of Dubai before they thought of anything else. At the time, that request bordered on absurd. Dubai in the early 90s was not the Skyline you know today. It was a modest Gulf city with ambition it hadn't yet proven. There was no Burj Khalifa, no Palm Islands, no international runway of 5-star towers. There was a young ruler with a fortune and a demand for something the world had never built. And there was an architect named Tom Wright, who picked up a pencil and drew the one shape every sailor in the Gulf had known for 1,000 years, the curved, wind-filled sail of a dhow. It looked less like a hotel and more like a myth someone had sketched on a napkin. Nobody in that room in 1993 could have told you how you actually build a myth. That problem? The gap between the sketch and the sea is the entire story you're about to watch unfold. The site they chose made the challenge worse on purpose. Instead of building on the coastline, where at least the ground was real, the decision was made to push the hotel 280 meters offshore, alone, surrounded by water on every side, connected to the mainland by nothing but a future bridge that didn't exist yet either. Why do that to yourself? Because isolation was the point. A building standing completely alone in the sea reads as untouchable, unapproachable, almost sacred, and Sheikh Mohammed wanted the world's most famous hotel to feel like it was floating. But floating buildings need something to stand on, and there was nothing there. So on July 8th, 1994, a barge anchored itself over an empty patch of the Arabian Gulf, marked only by buoys bobbing on the surface, and the most expensive foundation problem in the region's history began. Here's the detail that should stop you cold. Engineers went looking for bedrock, the hard rock layer you're supposed to drive piles down into, so a tower has something unmovable to stand on. They found it, 180 meters below the seabed. That is not a typo. That is roughly the height of a 60-story building buried straight down under sand and silt and seawater, completely unreachable for a construction budget and timeline that had already been set, which meant the entire foundation strategy the world uses for skyscrapers was off the table before construction even started. There was no floor to stand on, so the engineers did something that sounds almost like a magic trick. They decided not to reach bedrock at all. Instead, 230 concrete piles, each one 40 meters long and 1.5 meters wide, would be driven straight down into the sand and simply gripped by it. Friction alone, the sheer surface area of 40 meters of concrete rubbing against compacted sand, holding up a tower that would eventually weigh more than 100,000 tons. If that sounds like trusting your entire life savings to a handshake instead of a signed contract, you're starting to understand exactly how much was riding on every single blow of that pile-driving hammer. For weeks, the barge did nothing but repeat the same brutal rhythm. Hammer strikes, pile sinks, hammer strikes again, deeper, through sand, through silt, inch by inch, 2 rigs working at once because the schedule had no room for patience. 230 times this happened. 230 times the length of concrete disappeared into water that had never held anything heavier than a fishing boat. Workers stood on a floating platform above open sea, watching a forest of concrete columns rise invisibly beneath them, and if you had asked any one of them what they were building, the honest answer would have been nothing yet. Because piles alone are not land. Piles are roots without a tree. For the island to become real, for there to be anything resembling solid ground where guests would eventually walk in bare feet toward an infinity pool, the sea itself first had to be pushed out and replaced. That process is called hydraulic filling, and it is exactly as violent as it sounds. Sand and water were sprayed into the space between temporary steel walls that had been driven. Around the entire footprint of the island, walls whose entire job was to hold the Gulf back inside them. Crews measured the fill level every single hour because the tolerance for error was almost non-existent. Pump the slurry in too fast and the pressure would blow out the steel walls, holding back the sea. Pump it too slow and the whole project would bleed months it didn't have. Week after week, the mixture settled, the seawater drained away, and then, for the first time in the history of that patch of ocean, land appeared where only water had existed. Not stable land. Loose, saturated, unreliable land that could not yet carry the weight of a garden shed, let alone a 300-meter tower, so vibratory probes were driven straight down into the new fill to shake it, compress it, force out every trapped pocket of water and air until the ground densified into something that could actually be trusted. Armor rock, some of it arranged in specially designed honeycomb concrete blocks used for the very first time anywhere in the Gulf, was laid around the new coastline to absorb the punishment of 100-year storm waves instead of letting them slam directly into the island and undo 3 years of work in one bad season. By the time this phase ended, the new island stood 7.5 meters above sea level, a wall of engineered rock, the only thing standing between the lowest floors, of a future 5-star hotel in the open Arabian Gulf. 3 years. That's how long it took just to invent the ground. And the building itself hadn't started yet. Think about the psychology of that for a moment. Somewhere in Dubai, investors and government officials were watching a billion-dollar budget disappear into something that, from the shore, looked like almost nothing happening. No tower rising, no glass catching the sun, just barges and pumps, and men in hard hats, measuring sand levels every 60 minutes on a strip of reclaimed seabed that could, in theory, still wash away if a single storm hit before the armor rock was finished. There's a particular kind of pressure that comes from spending that kind of money on something invisible, something you cannot photograph, something that only becomes real months later when the water finally drains and the first dry footprint appears where the tide used to reach. Every engineer on that site understood the stakes in a way that had nothing to do with aesthetics. If the sheet piles buckled under the weight of the hydraulic fill, if the compaction failed to densify the sand enough to carry a 300-meter tower, none of what came after, the gold, the marble, the sail, would have mattered because there would have been nothing solid enough to build it on. The entire 1,500-page architectural vision Tom Wright had sketched in 1993 was, for 3 straight years, entirely dependent on whether sand could be convinced to behave like rock. That is the part of the story people never see in the postcard photos. Before the Burj Al Arab became a symbol, it was a 5-year negotiation with physics, conducted mostly underwater, mostly out of sight, with the country's international reputation quietly riding on the outcome. What came next is the part almost nobody thinks about when they see the finished hotel glowing at night. But it is arguably the most unforgiving few weeks of the entire project. Every one of those 230 pile heads had to be trimmed down to the exact same level, within 5 millimeters, across an area the size of several football fields, sitting on an artificial island in open sea. Then came the raft, a single, continuous, concrete slab poured directly onto the trimmed pile heads and wrapped floor to edge in hand-tied steel rebar, designed to spread the entire future weight of the tower evenly across all 230 piles at once, so that no single pile ever had to carry more than its fair share. 70,000 tons of concrete went into that raft, poured in one continuous operation that could not stop. Because if it stopped, even for an hour, a cold joint would form, a hairline. Seam of weakness baked permanently into the foundation of the world's most photographed hotel, a fault line hiding under 202 guest suites for the next 100 years. So they didn't stop. Vibrators ran through every section of wet concrete to chase out air pockets. Cooling pipes were cast directly into the slab because concrete that thick generates its own heat as it cures, enough heat to crack itself apart. From the inside, if nobody controls it, so cold water was pumped through those internal pipes for weeks just to keep the interior below 70 degrees Celsius. Wet burlap covered the surface so it wouldn't dry and shrink too fast. Expansion joints were cut at precise intervals so the slab could breathe with temperature changes instead of tearing itself apart. 70,000 tons of concrete poured continuously on an island that hadn't existed 36 months earlier, and the world's most famous hotel was still nothing but a slab underwater at that point. Nobody watching the sunset from Jumeirah Beach that year had any idea what was quietly curing beneath the surface a few hundred meters offshore. Only after the raft cured did the building begin to actually rise, and it rose using a technique that looks almost like sorcery if you've never seen it before. jump form construction, where the formwork that shapes each concrete pour physically climbs the building on its own, floor by floor, with no scaffolding, running from the ground all the way up. Workers rode that formwork upward as it lifted itself, pouring the central concrete core one level at a time, stressing steel tendons through the slabs so each floor gripped itself under permanent compression, then stripping the forms and flying them to the next level to do it all again. Pour, stress, strip, fly the forms up, repeat. They did this 56 times. 56 individual cycles of the exact same brutal choreography, each one adding roughly one more floor to a tower that had absolutely nothing around it. No neighboring building, no windbreak, just open water in every direction. And men working at heights, where turning around to look for solid ground meant looking at the Gulf instead. By the time the crews poured the final section of the core, at 250 meters, the shape of the building was already unmistakable from the air, a V splitting open toward the sea, the mast of the sail already reading true even though the sail itself hadn't arrived, the concrete spine of the ocean, and somehow it was already iconic before a single decorative surface had touched it. Then came 9,000 tons of structural steel, delivered by barge, piece by piece, to build what is arguably the most misunderstood part of this entire building, the exoskeleton, that dramatic curved white frame on the outside that most people assume is decoration. It is not decoration. It is the skeleton doing its most important job in full view, resisting the entire wind load of a 300-meter tower, standing completely exposed to Gulf winds with nothing around it to break their force. Every single bolt connecting that frame was torqued to exact specification because every one of those bolts was carrying real, measurable force, not aesthetic weight. Diagonal cross bracing went in next, 2 workers bolting simultaneously at opposite ends of each brace, and with every brace installed, the entire frame doubled in stiffness. You could almost feel the building becoming more certain of itself with each connection. Somewhere around 200 meters up, the Almantaha arm was bolted into place, cantilevering 27 meters out over open water with nothing beneath it but air and sea, built to carry a working kitchen and a dining room full of guests floating, structurally speaking, on almost nothing but engineering confidence. A few floors above that, at 210 meters, workers bolted together a helipad standing over open water, a landing circle painted onto a steel deck where men worked with the entire Gulf visible directly beneath their boots through the gaps in the structure, long before Roger Federer would ever play tennis on that exact spot, or Tiger Woods would tee off from it for a television camera. Nobody watching those celebrity stunts years later ever saw the version of that helipad where it was just steel beams, open sky, and men in harnesses with nothing to catch them if a single bolt failed. It's worth sitting with what that work actually looked like day to day, because the footage that eventually made this building famous never shows it. 2,000 workers cycled through this site over 5 years, many of them living far from the families they were supporting, climbing exoskeleton steel 300 meters above open water with no adjacent building to break the wind and no ground crew close enough to help if something went wrong. There was no elevator during the structural phase, just the steel grid itself, a harness, and a very long climb, repeated every single day, in Gulf heat that regularly crossed 40 degrees Celsius. The night pours on the raft ran under floodlights because concrete on that scale, once started, could not be allowed to stop for something as ordinary as sunset. Storm season in the Gulf isn't gentle, and every phase of construction, from the temporary sheet piles ringing the reclaimed island to the exposed core standing bare and unclad at 250 meters, had to be engineered to survive weather events strong enough to undo months of progress in a single afternoon if the design margins were wrong. This is the version of the Burj Al Arab that never makes it into the brochure. Not gold leaf and marble, but ordinary men doing extraordinarily dangerous, extraordinarily precise work, day after day, on an island that had been open sea a few years earlier, building a monument to luxury one bolt and one pour at a time, mostly anonymous, mostly unphotographed, and entirely responsible for the fact that the building is still standing today. The sail came last, and it might be the most quietly brilliant material decision in the entire project. The white fabric skin isn't paint, and it isn't plastic. It's a Teflon-coated woven fiberglass membrane engineered to survive. 50-degree Gulf heat, direct sun, and constant salt spray for roughly a century without degrading. And it does something almost nobody notices until you're told. In daylight it glows, diffusing sunlight into that soft white glow the building is famous for. And at night the exact same fabric becomes a screen, letting interior light bleed outward, so the whole tower turns into a lantern over the sea. One material, doing both jobs, day and night, for 100 years, that was the design intention from the very beginning, not a happy accident. Every panel was cut to a slightly different geometry because the building's curve meant no two panels were identical. And every edge was fitted with reinforced connections capable of carrying the full tension load once that panel was stretched drum tight across the steel frame. Turnbuckles were tightened corner by corner until the fabric pulled taut. And only then, for the very first time since Tom Wright's pencil sketch back in 1993, did the building actually look like a sail. Workers tapped every single panel by hand afterward, listening for slack, because a panel that flutters in Gulf wind is a panel that fails within a year. And failure wasn't an option on a structure this exposed, this photographed, this expensive to be wrong about. Inside, the building shifted from raw engineering into something closer to obsession. The atrium alone runs 180 meters straight up through 18 stories, and standing at the bottom doesn't feel like standing in a hotel lobby. People who've been there describe it as standing inside a tower made entirely of light. Every one of the 202 suites is double height, every partition engineered to exact acoustic specification, every ceiling panel curved and prefabricated off-site to a slightly different radius, so that literally no two rooms in the entire hotel share the exact same shape. Workers applied 22-karat gold leaf to columns by hand with a brush, because the material is so thin that touching it with bare fingers would tear it apart before it ever reached the wall. Carrara marble was fitted at lobby level with veining, matched slab to slab, each piece checked against its neighbor before the adhesive was allowed to set, because a visible seam in the stone would have undone months of precision on every floor above it. The aquarium walls, 18 centimeters of solid acrylic, were engineered to individually hold back nearly 1 million liters of water pressure, permanently, silently, for decades. 1,790 square meters of 20 property, a scale of manual labor that is almost impossible to picture until you try to imagine covering an area larger than several tennis courts in gold the size of stamps, one piece at a time without a single visible overlap. And through all of it, through gold leaf and marble and Teflon sails, the building never stopped being, underneath everything, an engineering argument won against open water. The private bridge connecting the island to the mainland grew span by span across those same 280 meters of sea the barge had first anchored. Over back in 1994, and when the final section of deck was paved and the barriers fitted and the lights wired in, the island touched land for the first time in its 5-year existence. Fire systems were tested floor by floor from the basement to the mast top. The main electrical switchgear was energized and the building drew its first full load of power, every system alive at once for the first time. Exterior lighting was aimed section by section from a barge floating in the same water the piles had once been driven through. And on December 1st, 1999, 5 years, $1 billion, 2,000 workers, 230 piles, 70,000 cubic meters of concrete, and 9,000 tons of steel later, the doors opened on a building that had begun its life as nothing but buoys marking an empty patch of the Arabian Gulf. Here, finally, is the number that changes how you should think about everything you just watched. This building has now stood in open water, on reclaimed sand, resting on friction alone for more than a quarter of a century, through Gulf storms, through blistering summers, through decades of salt spray eating at exposed steel. And it has not moved, not settled unevenly, not tilted. The engineering that looked, in 1994, like a billion-dollar gamble on sand instead of bedrock has quietly proven itself correct for over 25 straight years, which is precisely why almost nobody talks about it. Perfect engineering is invisible engineering. The failures make headlines. The successes just get photographed by tourists who have no idea what's underneath their feet. That is the real achievement hiding behind every image of this hotel you have ever seen. Not that it looks like a sail, but that a piece of ground which did not exist in 1994 has held up a 100,000-ton building without a single structural compromise for 25 years and counting. What makes this story worth telling isn't just the number on the budget or the height on the spec sheet. It's the sequence nobody sees when they scroll past a photo of this hotel online. The fact that before a single gold leaf or marble slab or turquoise pool ever existed, men had to invent solid ground out of open sea and then bet a 100,000-ton tower on nothing but sand friction and faith in the engineering. Every layer of luxury sitting on top of that foundation is, in a strange way, a kind of quiet tribute to the 230 piles nobody ever sees again once the marble goes down. The Burj Al Arab wasn't the result of Dubai already being famous. It came first, deliberately, as the single image meant to make the rest of the skyline possible. Everything that followed, every tower, every palm-shaped island, every record broken in that city since, followed the sail that stood alone in the Gulf for years before it had any neighbors at all. Stand on that private bridge today, cross those 280 meters of water the way every guest does, and somewhere beneath your feet, buried under compacted sand and 70,000 tons of concrete, 2 130 pillars are still gripping the seabed exactly the way they have since 1994. Silent, invisible, and doing the one job nobody claps for, holding up the myth. Compare this to almost any other landmark you can name, and the difference becomes obvious. The Eiffel Tower sits on solid Parisian ground. The Empire State Building rises out of Manhattan bedrock that geologists consider some of the most stable in the world. Even the Burj Khalifa, standing far taller than the Burj Al Arab and built more than a decade, later just a few kilometers inland, could rely on a foundation system anchored into ground that had at least always been ground. The Burj Al Arab had none of those advantages. It is, quite possibly, the only hotel of its scale and fame on the planet where the land itself is as manufactured as the building standing on it, where the sea had to be pushed back, measured, drained, compacted, and armored before a single architectural decision could even begin to matter. That is the detail that separates this project from almost every other engineering story people tell about the 20th century. Most famous buildings are about what humans built. This one is about what humans built the ground to hold, and then, only after solving that problem, decided to build a sail-shaped monument to luxury on top of it, apparently just to make the achievement look effortless. There is also something worth noticing about the timeline itself, about the fact that this entire transformation, sea to skyline icon, Azumbas, happened inside 5 years, faster than many countries take to approve the paperwork for a single office tower. 3 years spent almost entirely underwater and underground, invisible to anyone standing on the beach, followed by less than 2 years in which 2,000 workers turned a bare concrete core into the most photographed hotel silhouette on Earth. That compression, that speed, only becomes possible when every single phase has been engineered with almost no room for error because there was no slack in the schedule to absorb a mistake. A cold joint in the raft, a slack panel in the sail, a bolt torqued incorrectly on the exoskeleton at 200 meters. Any one of those failures, multiplied across a project this size, could have added months or years the budget didn't have. The fact that none of them did, the fact that this building opened on December 1st, 1999, roughly on schedule, roughly on budget, standing exactly where the buoys had marked empty water 5 years earlier, is arguably a bigger engineering story than the sail-shaped silhouette everyone actually talks about. So the next time you see a photograph of the Burj Al Arab glowing white against a Dubai sunset, or catch a glimpse of it in the background of someone's vacation reel, look past the gold leaf and the marble and the impossibly blue infinity pool for just a second, and remember what's actually holding all of it up. Not bedrock, not luck. 230 concrete piles gripping compacted sand with nothing but friction, a 70,000-ton raft poured in a single unbroken operation, and roughly 2,000 workers who spent 5 years turning open ocean into the most recognizable hotel silhouette on the planet. One pile, one pour, one panel, one bolt at a time, until something the sea never intended to hold became, against every reasonable expectation, permanent.